Hey, everybody, we're back again with Paul Craig Roberts for another topic in the news and of great importance to the nation. It's the Discord leak and top national security secrets revealed on social media in a chat room by a 21-year-old National Guardsman, Air National Guardsman from Massachusetts. Now, Paul, what's interesting to me about this, when I heard this news of this, it immediately recalled an interview we did a month and a half ago where you were stating the disinformation about who was winning in Ukraine. You said it's not a matter of Ukraine rolling over the Russians. The Russians have the upper hand, and other disinformation considering Ukraine, the weapons, and who's actually fighting in that war. Is it more than a proxy war? You laid all this out before the Discord week. The Discord week apparently confirms everything that you were telling me a month and a half ago.
Yes, well, I'm not surprised about that. Uh, but I assume we're talking about the leak that's being blamed on the airman, the 21-year-old airman from.
Right.
So if you look at this leak from the airman, it most clearly is not from the airman. This is explained by a former CIA operative who used to draw up the documents that are alleged to have been leaked by the airman. I posted it this morning. There's an interview of this CIA officer, former officer or operative. His name is Larry, and I forget his last name. And it's by that judge, Napolitano.
Napolitano.
Yeah, okay. It's on my site today. There's a video interview of the interview. And what the CIA operative says is, look, first of all, they claim there's hundreds of documents. He says there's not. I've not been able to find a dozen. But I found two, and the principal one could not possibly have been leaked by the airman because it's an internal CIA document subject to clearances that nobody in the military has. And that the Pentagon chief wouldn't have been able to get it. And he said similarly for the other documents. So he's only seen two, but they're the principal ones. And he says, notice too, that the story was in the Washington Post and the British Guardian before the government knew it. Then he says, how did that happen? He said, because this was an orchestrated intelligence leak by the National Security Council. And they had the stories ready for their two assets, the Guardian in England and the Washington Post. And they put the stories in the paper before the government knew of the leak.
Similar to the Kennedy assassination, by the way.
Yeah. So he says, here we have two proofs that this is an orchestrated thing. He said that there's no see, the story is that this airman was fixing computers in a military base, and that the documents were lying on a desk or they were in a computer. And so fixing the computer, he found the documents. Well, the CIA guy says there's no way possible that those documents would have been on any military computer because they're an internal document in the CIA subject to levels of security far, far above top secret. And the only way it could have got out would be the National Security Council put it out. So why did they put it out? And I believe he's correct, because it also, what he says, agrees with what James Jesus Angleton told me back in the 70s. He was the chief of CIA counterintelligence, and he said whenever we pull off a disinformation campaign, either to set somebody up or to prepare the public for something we're about to do. We have a story ready, and the story is planted in our agents in the press before we do the deed. And then he says we have another dozen explanations, because we know sooner or later the original cover story will wear out, like the Kennedy one did and like the 9/11 one did. We then had to have the Saudis. And then we released two more explanations. And then everybody fights over which of these two is right, and they forget about all. And he said sooner or later, the longer this goes on, the CIA itself doesn't any longer know. Okay, so this is what the CIA guy says. He says these documents were an orchestrated release at the highest levels. Why? He said is to prepare the narrative for the coming collapse of American power. We're collapsing in Ukraine. Europe is now abandoning us, like President Macron the other day in France. The French president said, we're not an American vassal. Well, that's a new thing, if they're not. And he won't take our side over the Taiwan issue. And now we see the Germans are hemming and hawing about it. And now we see Europeans meeting with the Chinese. And now we see the Saudi Arabians making an alliance with Iran because of the Chinese. And we see our hold on the empire in Europe is collapsing, you see, and the dollar, because the Saudis are saying, oh, we're taking other currencies in payment for our oil. Well, this upsets the petrodollar. And not only that, we've got the Russians saying we now do our trade in Chinese currency. And now Africa says that, and increasingly South America. So the demand for dollars is shrinking, but the supply of dollars isn't. Because we keep running big budget deficits that have to be financed, and big trade deficits because we offshored our industry. They have to be financed. Well, who's going to finance them? It was always easy in the past because people wanted the dollar to meet their international payments. They don't use the dollar. They don't need it. Who's going to finance it? Huge supply of dollars, a shrinking demand. What happens to the price of the dollar? It collapses. What happens when your currency collapses and you are import dependent? You have high inflation. I mean, really high. And it's outside any policy by monetary authorities. The Fed is helpless. It can't fight an inflation due to currency collapse. So there you have it. And so this is what the CIA and the judge, the CIA operative and the judge, and now increasingly other former CIA people are saying is the purpose of this leak. It's to create a narrative, and the narrative is they'll blame this poor kid, and they'll say, see what treason does. Look, treason has ruined us. We've lost power. We've got huge inflation. We're losing our allies. And they then will use this to go after everybody. All the critics of everything will be equated treason with this guy, the scapegoat they found to blame for the destruction of American power. So that seems to be what's in motion here. You see, it makes sense to me. It certainly makes sense. It goes along with everything else we've seen. Each piece of the pattern of making it more and more difficult to challenge any kind of official narrative. So that's the account.
So in other words, Paul, what they're doing with this leak is basically shifting blame for what they know is the irreversible collapse of American power. They know they can't stop it, but they could say it's an intelligence leaks like this that caused it. So they exempt themselves from blame. Is that what's going on?
Exactly. It's not Biden's fault. It's not the Democrats' fault. Yeah, it's not the sanctions' fault. It's all the fault of treason.
And it's also a way of suppressing increasingly any kind of criticism by equating it with treason.
Treason. Yeah.
Now, Paul, I mean, this is a momentous development, the collapse of American power globally. So where does that leave us as a nation? And how soon is it coming?
I would say that's up to the Russians and Chinese, not us. We're lost. Now, if they think that a sudden collapse is dangerous and expensive or could lead to war, they'll go slow in the transformation that's underway. If finally they just throw up their hands in despair and say, we just got to get rid of them, it'll go quick. So I don't know what decisions the Chinese president and the Russian president will make, but it's really up to them. It can go as fast as they want or as slow as they want.
When it does happen, when it happens, where does it leave us as a nation?
Poor, very poor. It leaves us a third world country like India in 1900. Why? Because we offshored all our manufacturing. That destroyed the American workforce, the budgets of cities and states that were former manufacturing centers. It's destroyed all the supply chains. It's destroyed the infrastructure, and it leaves us with huge trade deficits. We have no way of financing if the dollar is not the reserve currency. If the dollar is the reserve currency, we finance our deficits by printing dollars. But if nobody wants the dollar and it has a very low exchange value, you can't do that. And so we can't import, and yet we're import dependent. What do you do? I mean, you have to start your economic development all over again. But I don't see any way of doing that. So I think it just means the United States is finished. It's a finished, washed up place. There's nothing can be done. That's my view.
So you don't see any way of stopping this, any way of reversing this, any way of even holding current levels of status. You see this as inevitable. It is going to happen.
It's going to happen. It's just a question of the Chinese and Russians want it to be quick or soon. I would think they would be worried if it's too soon. The fools in the White House will push the button. And so I can see them drawing it out so that we accept it little by little, little by little, little by little. Whereas if it hits us all at once, we panic and go to war, push a button. And I would imagine that's the way Putin and the Chinese president are thinking. They're saying, this is, the Americans are washed up. We got to drag it out so that they don't overreact and just gradually accept. They get a little bit poorer every year rather than a lot poorer all at once. And that way the politicians can keep promising and spend more money and keep promising. And so I think that's the likely scenario, that they'll drag it out. And so we'll have a very slow decline, like the British had. The British decline was slow and drawn out. Of course, they're gone now.
Will we still be a sovereign nation, at least in name only? I mean, or will the Chinese and Russian governments actually become the government of the United States?
They don't want anything to do with us. Look, we're not a nation now. We're a Tower of Babel. There's no American nation. There's how many ethnicities now make up the population. It's nothing. The country has no relationship whatsoever to the country I was born in. I can't recognize it.
Yeah.
I cannot recognize it. So I mean, you already know anything you call, you get answered in Spanish.
Yeah.
And then in English. So, and you look around, any of the big cities, you look at them, they don't even look American. The population doesn't. And so there's not, and with the identity politics, everybody, they teach the blacks to hate whites, they teach the women to hate men. You have the Hispanics, you got all these Somalis and all that. I mean, it's just an endless mixture. And the assimilation process stopped back in the 60s. So it's not like, the Polish people who came in, the Irish people, the Scandinavian people who were brought in, but they were assimilated. You had to learn the language, you had to learn the Constitution. You know what I mean? And you don't have to do anything now. In fact, New York City lets illegals vote in local elections.
Yeah.
And so there's no country here, if you want to know the honest God truth. The only countries here is what the Trump supporters represent. And what are they trying to do? They're trying to get rid of what remains of the country, which is the Trump supporters. And so there's not a country. I mean, you and I, we lived in the last period of the United States. It has no future. There's no future here. Look already, if you're a white male, you're discriminated against. You can't, it's hard for you to get into university. It's hard for you to survive all the quota teachers and the women feminist teachers who are down on you because you're a white racist and a misogynist. The social agenda eats up the white male. The social agenda they pursue in the universities is destroying the opportunities for white males. You get out, you can't get a job. Why? Because they got quotas for the people of color, the quotas for the sexual perverts, quotas for women. Where you can't, what can you do? You can't do anything except accept your discrimination. If you do get a job, you have to take sensitivity training all the time. The military has put a hold on the promotion of white males. You can't get promoted because they won't balance. So they hire and promote by color, by gender, not by merit. So all the teaching that we went through, work hard, do a good job, you'll get ahead, not for white males. In fact, if you're a preferred minority, you don't have to work hard. You're going to get ahead anyhow because they got a quota. You don't have to do your job. They can't fire you.
Yeah.
So there's not a country here. People don't understand that. It's not a country. It's a Tower of Babel. And it was done intentionally, in my view, and it prevents any kind of unity of the population from controlling the government. How can you control the government when you're all at each other's throats? Well, that's where we are. We all look at the New York Times 1619 Project. America founded in racism. All whites are aversive racist. It's in the genes. It's in your skin color. You're stuck with it for life. You're an oppressor. And this is what they teach in sensitivity training to white males. And I think they teach it to white women now. So where's the country? It's not. And if you look at the appointments in the Biden administration, you don't see any sign of a WASP. A white Anglo-Saxon male Protestant is simply not in the Biden administration.
No.
You can't find any. And if you look at corporate ads, When's the last time you saw a white family in a corporate ad?
Yeah.
Why are the corporations promoting misogyny, mixed races and all? I mean, but they are. Wherever you look, America has disappeared. And yet whites are still 60 or more percent of the population, but they are being disappeared.
In fact, if you look at the TV ads, it appears that whites are now a minority because most of the ads, it's all minorities, minority faces in all of these ads, one after another on TV. You would think that the whites are a small minority now, judging by the content of the ads.
That's right. That's what I said. We're being disappeared. In our own country, where we are majority, we're being disappeared. And we suffer discrimination because the quotas are against us.
Okay, Paul Craig Roberts, thank you very much for the dire predictions. You've been right so often. I hate to think about how right you are this time. Something that you said in the last few minutes, I think should be our next broadcast, which is, you think that all this was done intentionally. Other people say it was just a building of happenstance of super liberal policies, but other people see a distinct pattern. So let's make that the topic of our next podcast with Paul Craig Roberts. Thanks very much for being with us.